What's the twist that turned your dream wedding into your worst nightmare? I was the wedding planner, and after 11 years in this business, I thought I had seen everything. I had seen a groom faint into the wedding cake. I had seen a bride's own mother show up drunk and try to fight the caterer over a shrimp allergy. I thought nothing could rattle me anymore. I was wrong. The couple was Daniel and Jasmine. I'd been working with them for almost a year. Daniel was this soft-spoken software guy, the kind of man who cried at his own engagement photos, and Jasmine was sharp and funny and organized in a way that made my job easy. She had a spreadsheet for her spreadsheets, color-coded and everything. Tabs for florals and tabs for seating charts, and a tab just called Miscellaneous Panic that she'd send me at 1 a.m. sometimes with 3 bullet points and a crying emoji. They'd been together 4 years, no drama that I ever saw, no red flags, nothing. His parents adored her. Her parents adored him. It was, genuinely, one of the easiest weddings I had ever worked on, which in hindsight should have scared me more than it did, because in this industry, easy is usually just quiet. I actually remember the day I met them for our first consultation at a little coffee shop near their apartment, and Jasmine showed up 15 minutes early with a binder, an actual physical binder, tabbed and color-coded, and Daniel showed up a few minutes after her looking sheepish because he'd gotten stuck talking to a coworker, and the way she just reached over and squeezed his hand without even looking up from her binder, like it was second nature, like she'd been doing it for years. That's the kind of couple they were. Easy, comfortable, the kind you plan weddings for and think, good, this one's going to last. The venue was this old restored barn about 40 minutes outside the city. String lights, exposed wood beams, the whole aesthetic. 210 guests. Jasmine had done her own makeup trial 3 times because she wanted it perfect. She kept saying, I don't want to look like a different person. I just want to look like me, but rested. Small detail, but it stuck with me because of what happened later. That idea of wanting to just be recognized as yourself. Because as it turned out, there was a whole version of herself that none of us, including Daniel, had ever been introduced to the morning of. Everything ran like a dream. I mean that literally, nothing went wrong, which for a planner is almost suspicious. The florist was early. The string quartet didn't get lost. Daniel's groomsmen weren't even that hungover, which for a group of 5 guys in their late 20s is basically a miracle. I remember standing in the back of the barn around 4 p.m. watching the light come through those big barn doors and thinking, this is going to be one of the good ones. The ones I actually remember fondly instead of the ones that give me nightmares. I even texted my business partner, this one's a dream. Smooth sailing, home by 9. I still have that text. I look at it sometimes. The ceremony started right on time. Jasmine walked down the aisle to a version of a song her dad used to sing to her as a kid, and I watched Daniel's face just completely fall apart in the best way. That ugly, oh my god crying face people get when they see someone they love more than they thought was possible. Her dad handed her off, kissed her on the forehead, whispered something that made her laugh through her tears. Everyone sat. The officiant, who was Daniel's Uncle Walter, started talking about commitment and partnership, real generic stuff, nothing special, and I was standing off to the side doing what I always do, scanning the crowd for problems, checking on the caterers, making sure the photographer had a clean sight line, half listening the way you do when you've heard 100 ceremonies and they all start to blur together after a while. They got through their own vows. Daniel's were sweet, kind of rambly. He thanked her for putting up with his anxiety, for making him a better cook. For that one time she drove 4 hours in a snowstorm just because he had a panic attack alone in a hotel room during a work trip and didn't want him to be by himself. Small, real stuff, not performative at all. Jasmine's were shorter. She wasn't a crier normally, but she was crying. And she said something like, you are the first person who ever made me feel like I didn't have to explain myself to be understood, which got a whole awe from the crowd. And I remember thinking at the time that it was a strange thing to say, a little heavier than the moment called for. But weddings make people say heavy things, so I didn't think much of it. I think about it constantly now. Then the officiant said the line, by the power vested in me, and before he could even get to the rest of it, a man stood up from a chair in the very back row. I want to be clear, I had a seating chart. I check every single name against every single chair the morning of. I did not recognize this man. Mid-50s maybe? Gray suit. The kind of suit that's expensive but not flashy. He had a leather folder in his hand, one of those zip-up ones lawyers carry, and he started walking down the aisle while everyone just froze. Because in the moment your brain genuinely cannot process what's happening, you think it's a prank video for their Instagram. Some people actually laughed. A groomsman near me even started clapping once, awkwardly, before realizing nobody else was. He wasn't laughing. He stopped about 10 feet from the altar and said, my apologies for the interruption, but I represent Whitfield and Cross on behalf of the Ashford family, and I need this ceremony to stop before it's completed. Ashford was Daniel's family name. This was his family's lawyer. Daniel looked at him like he'd never seen him before in his life, which it turns out he actually hadn't. Not this specific lawyer anyway, just the firm's name on some documents years ago when his family sold a property. Jasmine's face did something I will genuinely never forget. It went from confused to something closer to recognition, like a small flicker before she could control it. And I only caught it because I was standing close enough, and I've watched enough brides' faces over the years to know what real surprise looks like versus something else, versus the face of someone whose worst fear has just finally arrived on schedule. The lawyer said, I'm sorry, but we have documentation that Ms. Bennett is currently a party to an existing marriage registered in Clark County, Nevada in 2019 to a Michael Corleone, which has never been legally dissolved. Understated state law, this ceremony cannot proceed. I heard a few people actually laugh again at the name. Quiet, nervous laughter because it sounds like something out of a movie. And I think that little absurd detail is honestly what made the moment feel even more surreal. Like the whole thing had tipped over into something that couldn't possibly be real life. Except it was. Completely and devastatingly real. Dead silence after that. And I mean dead. The kind of silence where you can hear the string lights buzzing, where you can hear someone's chair creak 3 rows back, where the photographer, I found out later, actually kept shooting on instinct for a few seconds before he even registered what he was capturing. Daniel's mother stood up so fast her chair fell backward with a crack that made half the room jump. Jasmine's mother put both hands over her mouth. Daniel just kept saying, what, quietly, like a malfunctioning recording, like his brain had gotten stuck on a loop it couldn't break out of. And Jasmine didn't deny it. That's the part that still gets me. She didn't say that's not true. She didn't say there's some mistake. She just stood there at the altar in her dress with her bouquet still in her hand, and she started shaking her head slowly and said, "I can explain," which everyone in that barn understood immediately meant it was true. Turns out, and I only found this out weeks later because Daniel actually called me, not to yell at me, just because I think he needed to tell someone who'd been there. Someone who wasn't family and wasn't going to pick a side out loud even if they had one privately. Jasmine had gotten married very young, at 22, on a reckless 3-day trip to Vegas with her college boyfriend, the kind of impulsive thing you do at that age because it feels romantic instead of permanent. It fell apart within a year. He became controlling. There was some financial stuff, money that went missing from an account she didn't even know he had access to, credit cards opened in her name that she only found out about when a collector called her at work. And she left and moved across the country not long after and just never went through the legal process to formally end it because the paperwork felt like reopening a wound, filings and court dates and a lawyer's retainer she couldn't afford at the time. And she told herself she'd deal with it eventually, and eventually just never came. 4 years went by, and then she met Daniel at a mutual friend's birthday party and fell in love in a way she said she never expected to feel again. And every year that passed made it harder to bring up because how do you tell someone you're planning forever with? Oh, by the way, I'm still someone else's wife, legally on paper in a state she hadn't set foot in since she was 22. But here's the actual gut punch. The part that made this not just a case of someone being cowardly and putting off paperwork. Daniel's family had hired a private investigator 6 months before the wedding, not because they suspected this specifically, but because Daniel's mother, who I later learned had never fully trusted Jasmine's sudden appearance in his life, wanted a background check done, standard due diligence for a family with money, and it came back clean at first, until the investigator kept digging past the surface and found the marriage record filed with the county clerk. Daniel's parents had known for nearly 2 months and said nothing. They hired the lawyer, they had him wait. They let their son go through an entire engagement party, a bachelor party, dress fittings, the rehearsal dinner where Daniel's father gave a toast about how lucky his son was, all of it. And they let him walk down that aisle before pulling the plug in the most public, humiliating way possible in front of 210 guests, instead of just telling him privately a month prior over dinner, quietly, like people who loved him would have. When Daniel found this out days later, he told me it broke something between him and his parents almost as badly as it broke things with Jasmine. He said, "They didn't do it to protect me. They did it to punish her in front of everyone. They wanted an audience, and I will never forgive them for choosing a stage over a conversation." He told me his mother's exact words when he confronted her were, "I wanted everyone to see who she really was before it was too late." And Daniel said that was the moment he understood his mother had never once been thinking about him at all. Only about being right. Only about winning a war. None of the rest of them had even known they were fighting. Back at the barn, though, none of us knew any of that yet. All we knew was a stranger with a folder had just detonated a wedding in front of everyone's grandparents. Daniel's uncle Walter, still holding his little ceremony booklet, just quietly stepped back from the altar like he didn't know what his job was anymore. Like the script he'd rehearsed for weeks suddenly had no next line. The string quartet, who'd been queued up to play the recessional, just sat there with their bows down. One of them, the cellist, later told me she'd never had a wedding go silent like that in 15 years of playing them. Not even the one where the groom's ex showed up mid-ceremony, because at least that one had shouting. This one just had nothing. A whole barn full of people collectively holding their breath. Jasmine's father was the one who finally moved. He walked up to his daughter, took the bouquet gently out of her hands like he was disarming her, and said something to her low and quiet, just for her. The kind of thing only a parent knows how to say in a moment like that. And she just nodded and started crying in this completely different way than she'd been crying 5 minutes earlier during her vows. This wasn't happy crying. This was the kind of crying where your whole body just gives up holding itself together, where your shoulders cave in and you look about 10 years younger and 10 years older at the same time. Daniel didn't yell. I braced for him to yell. Instead, he just stood there in his tux at the altar, alone now, and said quiet enough that only the front few rows heard it, "Is it true?" And Jasmine said, "Yes, and I'm so sorry. I was going to tell you before. I swear I was. I just kept waiting for the right moment and it never came, and then it was too late, and I was too scared." And Daniel just nodded slowly, in this way that looked almost calm from a distance, but up close, you could see his jaw was shaking, and said, okay, and walked out the side door of the barn by himself, still in his tux, past 210 people who did not know whether to look at him or look away. Nobody followed him for almost a full minute. 200 people just sitting there in silence in a barn full of flowers that cost $11,000, staring at an empty altar, at a bouquet now in the wrong father's hands, at a bride standing alone in a dress she'd cried actual happy tears trying on 6 months earlier. I ended up being the one who found him. Actually, out behind the barn near where we'd stacked the extra folding chairs, sitting on an overturned crate still in his full tux. Jacket off, tie loosened, staring at nothing in particular. Just at the tree line past the parking lot. I didn't really know what to say to him. My job is supposed to be flowers and timelines, not this. But I sat down next to him anyway, careful about my dress. And for a while, neither of us said anything. We just sat there listening to the crickets starting up as the sun went down. And then he said the thing that has genuinely stuck with me more than anything else that day. More than the lawyer, more than the gasps, more than the sound of his mother's chair hitting the floor. He said, I don't even care about the marriage thing. People make mistakes. People run from hard paperwork. I get it. Honestly, if she'd told me on our first date, I probably would have helped her deal with it and we'd have laughed about it years later. What I can't get past is that she looked at me every single day for 4 years and let me build a whole future with her that legally could not exist yet, and never once gave me the choice to decide if I was okay with that. She didn't trust me enough to be disappointed and stay. She just decided for both of us that I'd rather be lied to than be given the chance to choose her anyway. I asked him gently what he was going to do, and he just laughed, this small broken laugh, and said, I don't know, go home I guess. Take off this ridiculous tux, figure out how to tell 200 people to eat the cake without us. They didn't get back together. As far as I know, Jasmine flew back out west about 2 months later to formally end the first marriage, filing the papers in person this time, no more putting it off. And Daniel moved out of the apartment they shared within the month, into his college roommate's spare bedroom, which he told me felt like some kind of cosmic joke, going backward a decade in one afternoon. His parents tried to reach out to me afterward, asking if I could maybe help salvage some of the deposits since the venue was non-refundable, and I did what I could. Negotiated a partial credit with the caterer, got the florist to agree to a smaller refund than usual as a favor since we'd worked together for years. But honestly, a big chunk of that money was just gone. Eaten by cancellation fees, the way these things always go. $11,000 of flowers? Wilting in a dumpster behind a barn nobody would ever get married in again as far as that family was concerned, the barn owner told me. Afterward, it was the quietest a wedding crowd had ever cleared out. Usually there's chatter, laughter, people saying their goodbyes, hugging in the parking lot, taking one more photo by the string lights. That night, everyone just sort of filed out in silence like they'd witnessed something they weren't supposed to see, which I guess, in a way, they had. Something private turned public in the worst possible way. A marriage that should have stayed a quiet family conversation, instead becoming the story everyone at that barn would tell for the rest of their lives. I still think about the small stuff sometimes. How she wanted her makeup to look like herself, just rested. How Daniel cried during his own vows about her making him a better person, about the snowstorm, about the panic attack in the hotel room. How none of that was a lie exactly. It was real. All of it was real. It just wasn't the whole truth. And I think that's the part that actually breaks a wedding apart worse than any affair or any cold feet ever could. Not one big lie, just one very long, very quiet omission that somebody let sit there for 4 years hoping it would eventually stop mattering. Folded up small enough to carry around without anyone noticing the weight of it. It never does stop mattering though. It just waits for the worst possible moment, the most public moment, the moment with the most people watching and the least room to hide, and then it matters more than anything else ever has. I don't do weddings the same way anymore, honestly. I still love this job, I still cry at good ones, but I ask different questions now during consultations. Not because I think I could have caught this. There was nothing to catch. Jasmine hit it well and hit it from someone who loved her, not just from a planner scanning a seating chart.